The novel we'll be reading this episode is Crotchet Castle by the English novelist, satirist and critic Thomas Love Peacock, and it was published in 1831. And to talk about it, I'm delighted to be joined by two contributors to the LRB, Freya Johnston, who teaches English at Oxford and who has actually edited Peacock's novels, so very much in charge today, and and Tom Keymer, who teaches English at Toronto, who wrote about Peacock in the LRB a few years ago, and you can find that in the archive online. Freya and Tom, welcome to Novel Approaches. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire.
Okay, Freya, could I start with you? Could you give us a brief introduction to Peacock? Who was he? What was his background? What kind of things did he write?
Yes, sure. So Peacock was born in Dorset in 1785. He was the only child of an unhappy marriage. His parents separated early on in his childhood, and his father died not long after that. It might be worth noting in relation to that background that the households where his novels are set are never really conventional. They don't tend to have mothers in them. Even if the stories do also tend to end happily in marriage, they are not necessarily conventional setups. The other thing, I guess, to note about his childhood, as well as its kind of disrupted quality and his parents' unhappy marriage, would be that money was always something that was in short supply, and that's probably the reason that Peacock had to leave school, age 12. And after that, he was largely self-educated, really, really good at languages, Greek, Latin, French and Italian, but someone who acquired those skills himself. He always knew, I guess, that he wouldn't be able to go to university and that he would have to work for a living, unlike Percy Bysshe Shelley, his closest friend, whom he met in 1812. And he's often Peacock in financial distress, also involved in a disastrous series of love affairs in his early 20s. Shelley granted him an allowance in 1815, but from 1819, Peacock didn't need it anymore because he was securely employed at East India House, where he stayed for the rest of his very long working life. And then in terms of his literary career, well, he starts off as a poet, but doesn't achieve a great deal of success in that form. And by his late 20s, I'm sure mostly because of his friendship with Shelley, he'd come to realise that his talents lay in other kinds of writing, although he did carry on composing poems and songs, and some of those feature in Crotchet Castle. From 1815, he starts to publish these odd prose works that we are calling novels, but which he didn't identify by that name. He usually called them romances or some other variation on that title. And those works were immediately successful, albeit not, hugely popular, but they were very well received. And 5 of them had appeared before Crotchet Castle. The first one is Headlong Hall. That's the one that he's best known for in his lifetime, although these days, I guess, Nightmare Abbey is the most popular of the 7 works of fiction. And after Crotchet Castle, because he's so busy with the day job, he doesn't publish another novel for 3 decades.
And could you tell us a bit about the composition of Crotchet Castle? So what were its immediate influences and contexts?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that Peacock from 1815 was working at East India House. And by the time Crotchet Castle was published, he'd been there for quite some time, and he soon became really, really indispensable to his employers because he's such a practical man of business. He is the company's recognised expert on steam navigation, a new technology that features in Crotchet Castle alongside all other kinds of fads and projects. He was really proud, Peacock, to have supervised the design and construction of a new kind of iron steamer, or iron chicken, as he called it, a boat with movable keels that could be used at sea, but also in the shallower river waters as they approach trading posts. So he's very proficient scientifically and in technological terms, as well as in novelistic form. And that work at East India House brought him into contact with lots of other people, including leading utilitarian thinkers and writers, James Mill, his son John Stuart Mill, the founding father of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, also somebody that Peacock came to know really well through that work. And I guess utilitarianism, we should say, given that it's a major ingredient in Crotchet Castle, what is it? Well, it's a kind of ethical consequentialism, a sort of code whereby right and wrong are determined by results, by outcomes, rather than the intentions of the agents. And it's most famously summarized as the pursuit of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And it is one of Peacock's targets in this novel. And then I guess another immediate influence on the work is the financial crisis of the mid-1820s, when a period of massive overlending led to the failure of 80 banks. And Peacock circulated at East India House what came to be known as his paper money lyrics, parodies basically imitating lots of the leading poets of the day. The aftershocks of that banking crisis continued into the late 1820s, and Peacock published in 1829 a satirical poem called Touch and Go about a famous case of two absconding rogue bankers, and that features also in Crotchet Castle. The lyrics themselves, though, weren't actually published till 1837, when conveniently a new financial panic was brewing, and Peacock produces a preface for that 1837 publication where he talks about the relevance of these poems to every time and place. This is him. Every time and place in which public credulity shall have given temporary support to the safe and economical currency, which consists of a series of paper promises made with the deliberate purpose that promises shall always be a payment and the payment shall always be a promise.
Okay, so Tom, can I ask you, without deviation or repetition, to walk us through the plot of the novel, or I guess plots, because there are maybe a couple here. So where is it set? Where do we begin? What happens?
Yeah, could I just add one really little basic thing to what Freya just said about the biography, which is just that I think, and this is relevant to this, I think, commitment to fun that there is in the novel, that he does come across as having been a really unhappy person or not having been a happy person. You know, there is this story about him that when one of his friends is trying to get money for him before Jelly starts funding him and appeals to the Royal Literary Fund and says he has reason to dread that the fate of Chatterton might be that of Peacock. So, you know, that's long before Crotchet Castle, but maybe tells you something about him. And as Freya mentioned, you know, that there is this sort of compulsive issuing of proposals to women. I mean, I counted like 10, I think.
That's too many.
2 of which are accepted, but the first person changes her mind, and he, you know, proposes to one sister at one point. She rejects him, so he proposes to the other one, and then he proposes to somebody who's supposed to be an heiress, and it turns out not to be an heiress, and he ends up in a debtor's jail. And this is all in the 18 teens. So he comes across as this sort of slightly desperate person, which is, you know, interesting when you think how poised and fun-driven the text is. So the plot. Well, I mean, in a way, you know, is there one? I mean, as Freya said, you know, his first novel, Headlong Hall, kind of sets the template for what he writes. And everything after that, he does a sort of Walter Scott move, you know, by the author of Headlong Hall, and it's going to be similar. And Headlong Hall is really people talking and expressing opinions, crazed people expressing madcap opinions. And so Crotchet Castle does that a little bit, and a lot of the things that we think of as really basic to the novel genre, you know, elaborate plots and complex characters and protagonists with rich inner lives who develop or mature as the novel goes on. Peacock doesn't really seem to be interested in doing that. We're not really getting that. What we have is a kind of enabling situation like that of this first novel, Headlong Hall. A bunch of characters or caricatures or spokespersons for different positions brought together in a country house, Crotchet Hall, which belongs to this wealthy retired merchant who loves debate. He's called Mr. Crotchet. He craves intellectual stimulation. He likes hosting what he calls great and interesting controversies, which I should like before I die to see satisfactorily settled, which of course is not what happens. So that's the premise, you know, a debate between characters obsessed by their different positions, and the conversation starts in a country house, just like Headlong Hall. Only this time the country house is right on the Thames. So when summer begins, they take the debate onto the water. They're on a boat. In fact, they're on a flotilla of pleasure boats, a choice philosophical party, Mr. Crotchet calls it. And they go upstream. There's maybe something a little bit significant about that they're going against the flow. They go past Oxford, they go past Lechlade in Gloucestershire, they go through the Thames and Severn Canal, they go up the Severn into North Wales. I'm not really sure whether that works geographically or not, but anyway, that's where they end up. They end up in Merionethshire. And that's where Peacock sort of brings in the romance-driven side of the plot, because he does also write kind of more romance-like novels, or has done that earlier. So you get this very sweet comic courtship between one of the talkers, Mr. Chainmail, who's an obsessive medievalist, and an ethereal, but we're also told plump Welsh beauty, who turns out to be, I mean, if we can do the spoilers, turns out to be the daughter of one of these dodgy absconded bankers. Then there's another romance plot going on at the same time between young Mr. Crotchet's hard-nosed son, who's jilted the Welsh beauty, and when he finds out she hasn't got any money, and he's now courting a smart but hard-up young aristocrat named Lady Clorinda, who is halfway to being engaged to somebody else, a penniless, half-pay military officer. So as you say, the plot's got a lot to do with financial shenanigans. And then all these things come together for more feasting and talk when the characters reconvene for a Christmas banquet. In a new environment, Chainmail Hall, the house of Mr. Chainmail, his pseudo-medieval estate, and all kinds of interesting stuff happens at that point.
Perfect.
So
Love
I think
it.
that's about it.
Yeah. And just to relate back to what Freya was saying about the banking crisis, that moment that enables the romance plot is the absconding of Mr. Touch and Go, who I believe was based on a real banker who also lost all his money and his clients' money and absconded to America. And his absconding means that his daughter, Susanna, is no longer a sort of prize fish for Mr. Young Crotchet Jr. to marry, so they break things off, or he breaks things off and dumps her, and that then means that they are all single at the beginning of the novel. And it also means that sort of, money is kind of the condition for the various romance problems that then emerge. So, Tom, you mentioned briefly that this was, like Headlong Hall, a novel of talk, a novel of set-piece dialogues between characters who are often mouthpieces for opinions. So how does that work in practice? How does the prose sort of swing between third-person narrative and dialogue? And how is it different from more, realist modes that we might expect?
Right. Yeah. So there's an interesting thing he says in an essay that he writes about French fiction, actually, when he says that there are two kinds of novels. There's one in which characters are abstractions or embodied classifications, and the implied or embodied opinions are the main matter of the work. And then there's the other kind where characters are individuals and the events are the, what you're interested in, and opinions are just kind of incidental there. So he's describing in that second category, kind of realist, character-driven, action-driven novel that he's not writing. He's writing the first kind that is all about these opinions, which are the main matter of the work. And so the form that this actually takes in the novel is that repeatedly you'll get a sort of little narrative introduction, maybe for a page, but most of the chapter is just presented as dialogue, almost as it might be in a play script or something like that. There are 18 chapters in the novel, and I think only 3 of them, the first one and a couple of others, are pure narrative. Otherwise, he's really giving it over to these somewhat, crazed, obsessive characters talking, articulating their viewpoints, and there's not really any sense that they're doing what somebody might do in a Jane Austen novel. They're not revealing their own, kind of inner life. There's no inwardness. There's no inferiority. There's no interiority, rather. There's no sense of a consciousness unfolding. They're just presenting these opinions and I was going to say talking to each other, but really talking at each other. So, there are some more conventionally novelistic things going on, particularly in the later part of the work. There are farcical things. There are, people falling off chairs, people accidentally getting shot, and that kind of thing. But there's the romance element that becomes quite a sort of big thing towards the end of the work. But talk is really front and center throughout. There have been novels that have done this before. It's not in the novel genre entirely new. There's a really interesting mid-18th century novel by Henry Fielding's sister, Sarah Fielding, and a fellow satirist, Jane Collier, which looks on the page very much like a Peacock novel, but that's maybe not the most important kind of generic precursor that we could talk about.
Yeah, on that, Freya, where does the novel of talk come from? What are its predecessors? What stands behind it?
I was just going to say in response to Tom's comments that there is evidence, if you look at the manuscript, that Peacock worked quite hard to arrive at this form of mostly dialogue, that actually he started off writing quite a lot of passages in third person narrative and then changed them into this more playscript type form, which you wouldn't necessarily expect someone to do. So he's obviously striving quite hard to come up with what looks to us, coming from a different kind of novelistic tradition, as quite alien. And as Tom said, there's a kind of rejection of interiority as the thing that you go to fiction for. And I think this is one reason why he didn't want these works to be called novels. He didn't think of these works as an exploration of interior character, even though there are all sorts of moments of lyrical, rhapsodic, and romantic identification of one character with another. That's not really what this is about. So in terms of predecessors and influences, I guess among the clearest ones are classical forms, including the Socratic dialogue, the kind of work recorded by Plato and Xenophon in which you test out the validity of different theories by arguing them through debate and discussion. And then more specifically, I guess the symposium, the kind of dinner table debate, that key part of Greek cultural life after a meal where you drink and talk and argue and listen to music or recite poetry or watch someone dancing. All of those elements come together in the kind of sociable quarrels that people have in Peacock, even if, yes, quarrels maybe suggest a degree more of engaged response than you often get here. You often do get the sense that people are just putting their own point of view across and not listening to anybody else's. One text that's especially important to the genesis of Crotchet Castle and other works of this kind by Peacock is a Satyricon, a Latin work from the 1st century that mixes prose with verse. So it's an example of what's sometimes called Menippean satire, or kind of mixed dish. And one bit of that text in particular is devoted to a host called Trimalchio and a lavish dinner that he hosts with all sorts of guests who badmouth him when he goes to the toilet, when he entertains lots of people who get more and more drunk and argue with each other about a load of domestic and public issues. And I think that gives a cue to Peacock to restage that kind of encounter involving all sorts of more recent, up-to-date people, but also people who themselves, at least in the case of Dr. Folliot, obsessively themselves recur to the past and want to bring in that classical context for whatever arguments everyone else is having.
Yeah, to make themselves sound smart.
Yeah,
most of the time. Yeah. You mentioned Menippean satire, which I think is important here because it's this kind of satire that deals, less with people than or vices than with mental attitudes.
Yeah.
And with systems, with intellectual systems. That the problem of having a systematic approach to the world is the thing that the satirist takes apart. And often these texts, don't stick to the sort of logic of narrative. They're broken up. They're full of these sort of chunks of dialogue. But that Menippean side to it is one of the reasons that Peacock had a kind of, a revival in the mid-20th century, I think. Critics started to be interested in him because of that element in his work.
But yes, he repudiates interiority in favour of a testing of ideas or a thought about systems or a kind of question about politics. And that repudiation of interiority is partly because he doesn't want to write novels, but it's also partly the experience of having been friends with Shelley and seeing what happened to Shelley's reputation after his death. Peacock hates biography and autobiography and the whole trend for that kind of writing. But anyway, I'll park that for now.
Yeah, I mean, Peacock, Socratic dialogue, I think, is not such a useful category as Menippean satire, because Socratic dialogue, you have a wise interlocutor leading a naive interlocutor sort of towards truth, and this absolutely it's not like that. They're all crazy, they're all deranged, they're all hobby horsical, and they're all trapped in their own thought bubbles, and they don't really hear each other. Whereas in Menippean satire, which, as you say, Claire, is all about intellectual movements and the jargons associated with different ideas, opinions, and attitudes and ideologies, whether it's philosophy or law or medicine or science. So, as Freya said, Petronius, the Satyricon, or sort of early modern and 18th century writers like Rabelais, Peacock is very interested in, or Robert Burton, The Anatomy of Melancholy. In the 17th century, or Swift, or Voltaire, or Sterne in the 18th century. That seems to be the kind of canon that he's wanting to position himself in relation to, writing in this, baggy, capacious, very mixed up kind of genre with lots of mock erudition and linguistic play and comic exaggeration of legal and medical and philosophical and scientific discourses. That's what's happening particularly. So just, on the point about Northrop Frye, here I am in Canada, where all Northrop Frye's books say he's Canadian. Well, all his books are. They're all in the library. I went a few days ago and had a look at his copy of Crotchet Castle, and he annotates it in great detail in ruinously tiny handwriting. But he says at one point, just in the margin of this book, he says, shut a dozen foils and cranks in a room, get them slightly drunk, and what more is there to a novel? So he just thinks this is we might think this is an odd kind of novel. He thinks it's the perfect novel precisely because of that Menippean character of just letting these wacky people talk at each other.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription.